as my friend Anindia had put it yesterday while talking about the significance of the course. We sometimes jokingly call Professor Jan Buchanan as the globe-trotting rock star of Deleuze studies. And believe me, due to his tremendous desire for globe-trotting, that he has been able to productively carry Deleuze studies to every corner of the globe while effectively displaying his reflective engagement with the former. It is because of Professor Jan Buchanan that some of us, academics like Professor George Varghese, to be precise, have been able to actualize an assemblage called Deleuze Studies in India Collective today, and it is in fact Professor Buchanan's guidance and scholarship that numerous conferences in Deleuze studies across Asia, Middle East, and the world showcases and hinges open. In addition to being the finest scholar of Deleuze studies, Professor Buchanan is currently the Director of Social Transformation Research, Wollongong University, Australia. He was also a Professor of Critical and Cultural Theory at the Centre for Critical and Cultural Theory at Cardiff University. Professor Buchanan has published on a wide variety of subjects across a range of disciplines, including literary studies, cultural studies, literature, music, space, the internet, and the war, as well as a number of other subjects. He is the author of the Oxford Dictionary of Critical Theory and the founding editor of the international journal Deleuze Studies. He is editor of a series of books, Deleuze Connections by Edinburgh University Press, Critical Connections, Play Tours, and Deleuze Encounters. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Professor Jan Buchanan to IIT Kharagpur. Welcome, Professor Jan Buchanan.
Use net or anything else?
No, I just want to turn this. I don't want to turn that screen off.
Oh, you want to switch off the screen?
Yeah.
That can be
Can you
possible.
do that? Okay. Great. Thank you.
Screen?
Yeah, all of them. I don't need any of them. Don't, yeah.
You don't want to.
Well, thank you, Saswat, for the fabulous introduction. If that is in fact my obituary, I will be a happy man. And thank you all for being here, and my apologies for not being here yesterday. I was here in spirit, but alas, not in body. So I was told not to talk about Deleuze all the time, so only probably the first lecture will be a little bit about Deleuze, and then the rest will be quite varied. I guess the other thing I should say by way of introduction is I really would not want to be seen as an expert on anything to do with India. I see myself as being a student of India, which, you know, if I spend the rest of my day studying it, I wouldn't even begin to pretend to think I would ever be able to understand it. So what I'm going to talk about is trends that are happening within the West that I think are beginning to happen here as well, but perhaps with their own inflections and with their own modulations that we can then begin to talk about. So the title of the first lecture then has to do with the notion of control and the idea of the control society, which is obviously from Deleuze, and I'm going to work through some of the Deleuze stuff and then also through some of the Foucauldian stuff as well. But I want to start with a question. What does it mean to be connected? We have been told, you know, for at least the last 30 odd years, that being connected is something that is desirable, It is a sign of modernity. It is something that we should aspire to. But what does it actually mean to be connected? So for the past 30 years or so, manufacturers of computers and computer software have been telling us that being connected is the ultimate commercial but also social state of being. So connected equals good, but it is unclear why we should accept this state of affairs. Why do we think being connected is so positive? Not so long ago, around 50 or 60 years, today's version, today's utopia, if you like, of being connected was seen as the ultimate dystopia. Our connectedness comes at a price, but it seems we've stopped asking what that price is, and perhaps we've stopped noticing that we are, in fact, paying a price. Now, I'm going to talk about this a lot, but I want to just use it as an example to set the scene. So I'm assuming, I think correctly, that everybody in this room has one of these in their pocket, right? Anyone doesn't? Right, so I read somewhere recently, Global Development Report, there's more of these in the world than there are toilets, which perhaps says something about the state of our planet. How many of you are connected to Facebook? Anyone not connected to Facebook? The 1 or 2 holdouts? Come on, get with the program. Nearly 2 billion people connected to Facebook. It's the world's largest ever social experiment. Okay, Facebook is currently worth 450 billion US. Okay, there is a steel factory in my town which is estimated to be worth maybe almost $1 billion. So it's 450 steel factories. Okay, monumental level of capitalization. What does it produce? Nothing. I mean, literally nothing. If Facebook stopped, like right now, I mean, I'd miss some of my friends, but, you know, the cars would keep driving, the world would keep spinning, you know, it could be replaced. But what's even more interesting about Facebook is the reason why it is worth 450 billion is because 2 billion people around the world devote their time for free to make it valuable. Okay, and not only that, you pay your cell phone provider for the privilege of doing work for free for Facebook to make it valuable. Okay, so like the slaves that built the pyramids in Egypt would be laughing at you. They're like, at least we didn't have to pay to be slaves. So that's what we're talking about. That is the state of the world that we're at right now. And that's why I want to say to you that the idea of being connected, which we have been taught to think of as a utopia, not that long ago would have been seen as a dystopia. And now I'm not trying to say that Facebook is dystopic in any particular way, but it is important to be realistic about the state of affairs and realistic about the way by which we are actively contributing to and constructing this kind of a world. So we have 2 questions. What does it mean to be connected? But with that, what are the costs, the consequences, the affordances of that connection? So what do we get out of it and what do we pay for it? So to set the context for the discussion, I want to turn to the essay published 25 years ago by Deleuze called Postscript on Controlled Societies. Now this essay can be readily found on the internet if you Google it. There's all kinds of illegal PDFs out there. Otherwise you can find it in Deleuze's book Negotiations. Now this essay has become a kind of a touchstone in cultural studies for the way it updates Foucault's work on prisons in particular and the idea of surveillance, but also because it offers a rather bleak vision of the future as controlled. And he took the word control society from Burroughs. Okay? So Foucault described the 18th and 19th centuries as being disciplinary societies, and according to him, they operated by organizing major sites of confinement, so prisons, hospitals, barracks, schools, and so forth. And in a sense, the idea is that if you create a space, that space will have a transformative effect on the people who must go there. So the idea is that the space itself is a kind of an apparatus. Okay, So it's not merely a container for life, but it's a transformational kind of machine. Now, individuals move then from one closed site to another, from the family to the school to the army, and so on. So Foucault's hypothesis was that the prison provided the model for all the other closed sites. And here he draws upon Bentham's idea of the Panopticon, a space designed in such a way that it was thought that it could alter human behavior. Now, am I right in assuming you all know what the Panopticon looks like? Yeah? Yes? No? Anyone want to say? Of course, as an Anglo person, I find the Indian yes looks like a no, so I don't... I don't know whether or not you're saying yes or no. Hands up who've got no idea what the Panopticon is. No one? Oh, excellent. Okay. Right. But in some ways it may be that the factory is the thing that most perfectly exemplifies the idea of discipline, because it is more about the idea of correct training than punishment. So the prison is kind of an extreme example, but if you think about factories and you think about Taylorization in particular, what you have then is what Deleuze calls machinic enslavement, whereby people are enslaved to the machine. You become cogs within the machine, but subordinate to the machine. You're not like an operator of the machine, you're just there as a necessary cog. And if they could replace you with a robot, they would, and in most cases they have. So one of the things that's being talked about, particularly in the US right now, is it the case that all the jobs in America are being stolen by people in Mexico or in India or wherever, or is it robots that are doing the job theft? And it's actually not that clear what is the answer to that particular question, because particularly in car manufacturing, a lot of car manufacturing has been offshored, sent to places like South Africa and so on, and Brazil. But by the same token, the car manufacturing that is taking place in the US has also become extremely highly mechanized, so that robots are replacing people for jobs just as much as jobs are being shipped overseas. So one of the things that you would be asking about India is what would happen to the poor people who currently do the sort of manual labor type jobs if their jobs were replaced by robots. I mean, then you would truly have a dystopia, right? And it's hard enough for the poor people of India today to make a living with the jobs that they have, but if they're then replaced by robots, what happens? It's the apocalypse. So the goal of correct training then is to adapt the human body to the needs of the machine. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this is Paul Virilio says in one of his books, I don't remember which one off the top of my head, but he says that the computer is designed for a disabled person. Now, it's kind of a provocative thing to say, but if you think about what the computer actually does, is it immobilizes you. Like the perfect computer is the computer for which you never have to get up and go and do anything, right? Like a failed computer is like, oh, I've got to get up and go over there and do something. Like I've got to get up and go to the shops. No, I can do this all from my, my laptop. So in other words, if you think about it, what computers are doing is rapidly making the body irrelevant. Like, so if you haven't seen the film WALL-E, it is like the most perfect realization of what the future is going to look like. Fat, blobby people floating around with their computers, not walking anywhere, just simply being in touch with their machines. But the point is, that's what we're doing. I mean, it's kind of like our model of ourselves as what is the perfect kind of a human. The perfect kind of a human is somebody who is attached to a machine and doesn't actually have to do anything, right? That we keep designing machines that restrict and limit what we personally have to do. It's a very, very strange conception of human ingenuity. Like the smarter we are, the less we have to do, but also the less relevant we are to the things that we do. And it kind of puts a new spin on it. Like, there's a very nice quote from Zizek where he says somewhere, I used to record all these movies on television, and then I never had time to watch them, and then I realized that the machine was watching them for me. And that's exactly where we're at, right? Like, we don't actually have to watch the TV because the TV watches it for us. And so we're becoming progressively irrelevant to our own cultural organizations. So that's the kind of trajectory of that I want us to sort of explore a little bit. So discipline then has three kinds of trajectories, if you like, or three elements to its apparatus. Firstly, it organizes elements. This is from Foucault. So it eliminates the unnecessary. So the idea of correct training is what are the necessary movements and what are the unnecessary movements. And so this was the first sort of great insight that Taylor had, and what we have come to think of as Taylorization, is that he looked at how people, he initially looked at people in the building industry, how they moved materials from one part of the factory to another, etc., etc. And he said there's too many unnecessary movements. How do we streamline it so there's fewer and fewer movements? Okay, so discipline organizes the elements. It says what things do we absolutely need and what things can be eliminated. Okay. Secondly, it assigns the elements a specific place. These things belong here, those things belong there, and it's through this organization of things that it is able to streamline them. And then thirdly, it schedules a specific time. So it gives temporality and spatiality, organizes those two things in such a way that it speeds everything up. Now, Foucault also knew, though, that these processes were short-lived. This is Deleuze's most controversial claim. He claims that Foucault thought that discipline was coming to an end or had already ended. All the die-hard Foucauldians around the world think Deleuze was completely wrong about this, that discipline lives on. But I think that's something that we could argue about. If you wanted to look at it differently, you'd think, as I mentioned this morning, about Raymond Williams and the idea of residual and emergent. Sure, discipline's still with us, but it's residual. The emergent trend is one of control. New things are coming into place. It doesn't mean the old things have disappeared, but they've lost their priority. We no longer need to discipline the body. If you think about what I was saying about the computers don't require us to discipline the body anymore because they've completely immobilized the body. The body is just a blob, it's just like fingers. And even if we can get to the point of not even needing fingers, of just thought processes going straight to the computer, that's the next step, right? So you can just be literally a blob. You don't even have to go, oh, I've got to raise my hand to press the key. Nothing, just thought straight to your machine, and it'll make you another smoothie or something like that. Okay, so from World War II on, then, according to Deleuze, we moved from a disciplinary society into what he wanted to call a control society. Now, as I said, this does not mean disciplinary practices cease to exist or to operate. It simply means that discipline ceased to be the dominant organizing model. In other words, what Deleuze is saying is that the control model was already being seen as being a superior model, and things were moving in that direction. So Deleuze says we're in the midst of a general breakdown of all sites of confinement, of prisons, of hospitals and factories, the school and the family, and so on. So he's writing this in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Now you may say, oh, but prisons haven't disappeared. But in a way that they have, right? So what you have, I don't know what's true here, but certainly in the US and in Australia and the UK, the prison is not the only place where people are imprisoned. Okay, so in the US, for example, for every one person who is in prison, there is at least 2 other people who are on some form of parole, remand, prison at home, etc., 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 etc. So in other words, the prison system has expanded beyond the boundaries of the prison itself. So in other words, you can still be at prison even if you're at home, because your life can be restricted. They can put devices on your legs so you can't leave a certain area. They can track you in all kinds of other ways. So in other words, the big institutions have broken down. Likewise, within the same period, for quite different reasons but similar kinds of effects, there was a sort of movement to open the doors of the asylum and say, people aren't really mad, it's just a social construct, go home and be schizophrenic there. And in some cases with quite disastrous consequences, right? Like people who genuinely needed to be in some kind of facility for care were then sent home with minimal care. So the institutions broke down. Government didn't want to be responsible for these block institutions. So in that sense, Deleuze was completely right. But the question, though, is not whether or not the new control society that is replacing disciplinary society is better or worse than what became before it, he says, because there is always a conflict between the ways they free us, and the ways that they enslave us. So one of the other things that's worth thinking about is around the same period, Foucault was already writing about his notion of biopower. And in many ways, Foucault's idea of biopower is already a form of controlled society. But one of the things that's really interesting about the concept of biopower, again, is this term something you're all familiar with? Hands up, no idea? Excellent. Saving me a lot of explanation. So the idea of biopower in Foucault is treated as fundamentally negative, but in many ways it's actually a much more ambivalent term. So take, for example, healthcare and the idea of smoking being bad for your health. Now, if the government starts a campaign to say to people, you should quit smoking because it's bad for your health, that's a pure example of biopower, because the government doesn't actually care whether you personally live or die, get cancer, your toes drop off, whatever. What the government cares about is it's going to cost us this much money to keep you in hospital, and it would be cheaper for us if you were to quit smoking, because then you wouldn't cost health. So in Australia, they've calculated that even with the enormous taxes that we have to pay in Australia on cigarettes, so like in Australia now, you won't believe this, a packet of cigarettes, like with 50 cigarettes in it, costs $50. Okay, so like, I don't know who can afford to smoke in Australia, but there are some die-hard people who are like, I'm going to smoke, I don't care. Even with this enormous tax on it, it's still the case that people who have smoking-related illnesses cost the government more money than they can raise in tax. So they are still quite determined to get people to quit smoking. Now, you might say that's biopower. It's a perfect example of biopower. But the question is it purely biopower? Like, is it purely a negative form of biopower? Or can we not say that this is the government actually caring for us, however, kind of backward kind of way? So what I want to suggest to you is that there is an ambivalence to these kinds of things. Should the government simply say, hell yeah, if you want to smoke, smoke, and to the tobacco corporations, if you want to get children addicted, have at it. Sell it in the schools, why don't you? Should we allow that? Should corporations just be allowed to do whatever they want? Should we be allowed to just, stupidly kill ourselves unknowingly? Who knows? So I want to suggest that this idea of biopower should be treated as an ambivalent concept and not as purely negative as the way as Foucault talks about it. So with the breakdown of the hospital as a site of confinement, for example, this is Deleuze again, community psychiatry, day hospitals, and home care initially presented new freedoms, while at the same time contributing to mechanisms of control as rigorous as the harshest confinement. So to give you an example, I don't know if you have this here, but it's a sort of a UK phenomenon. Do you have what's known as the healthcare postcode lottery? Is that a term that means anything to you? Postcode lottery? No? Okay, so in Britain, the healthcare system is organised by regions, okay? And every region has a budget for its healthcare, and every region then makes a decision about what kind of medical care it can afford to provide and what kind it can't. And as part of that decision, it says, well, we can provide these drugs to these patients, but we can't provide those drugs. So let's say you have some form of a relatively obscure kind of cancer, and you happen to be in this postcode, and they don't support the drug for that postcode, then you literally die because they won't provide you with the Medicare. But if perchance you happen to live across the river in a different postcode where they do support that particular drug, then you get to live. Okay? Postcode lottery. Wherever you happen to live determines you whether you live or die according to that kind of medal. So that is like the most extreme form of biopower. It literally doesn't care about your life as such. It cares about a budget. The budget becomes before you, and on the basis of that budget, decisions are made. So that's what Deleuze is talking about with this idea of controlled society being even harsher than forms of confinement. Because like here you are living at home, doing your own thing, and nonetheless you die. Deleuze's other hypothesis, if you like, is that if discipline was analogical, then control is digital. The places of confinement are independent variables. Every time we enter a new place, we start from zero. So you go to kindergarten, then you go to primary school, you go to high school. Every step along the way, you recommence. And these places churn out types of students who are united, moulded into a group. I would disagree with Ashish Nandi this morning when he's saying there's no such thing as an Indian or an Indian type. It's completely false. Of course there is such a thing as an Indian type. It may be the case that nobody actually embodies that, but there is nonetheless a type, and you are constantly being told this is what an Indian looks like. Same in Australia, we're constantly being told this is what it means to be Australian. Maybe nobody lives up to that, but the idea, the model, the type is constantly being put before us, and we're constantly being exhorted to try to live up to that. So, for example, factories produce workers, workers in turn produce unions, unions in turn produce a sort of minority that can function as a majority. Thus, the movement away from the kind of mass-produced identity is also a movement away from solidarity. So as the major workplaces start to break down, like in Australia the big factories are disappearing and being replaced by smaller operations, so then the possibilities for solidarity, so then the possibilities for unions, the possibilities for labour movements, the possibilities for large progressive change. Okay? And likewise, that's what you see in India. Religious movements are given greater prominence than your labour movements, and the idea of change is instead, talked about in terms of a kind of return to something that perhaps never actually existed, whereas unions are always looking forward to what will probably never exist, namely a workers' paradise where everybody gets paid a fair wage. So the breakdown of places then is also potentially the breakdown of places for rebellion, for dissidence, and for transformation. So you may sort of think it would be totally awesome if you never had to go to work again. You could just sit at home and be on your computer and do everything from home. But if you did that, which would be awesome, I'm sure, you would also be stepping outside of any form of a collectivity. You would be in Facebook land where you get onto Facebook and you say, those damn blah, 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 and put it on Facebook, and you've told them and you've changed the world. And meanwhile, nothing happens, right? The world just keeps on doing the same old thing it was doing before. So you've lost the connection, you've lost the solidarity, you've lost the capacity to change things. So we have to be really kind of focused on what is actually happening with the digital transformations, enabling a whole bunch of new things we couldn't do before, but taking away from us some of the things that we look upon as being old-fashioned, but were perhaps the core to our political strength. So control creates a system of constant variation or modulation, as Deleuze says, and it should be understood to be metastable. It has neither beginning nor end, and instead of progressive transformation from kindergarten through grade school to high school to university, what we get instead is these kind of fairly harrowing things like continuous education, continuous assessment. You are never ever done with learning. Like, I don't even know how we recruit students to university now. Like, the first thing we tell them when they come to university now is, so this degree you're going to do is of course an amazing degree. You're going to learn many new skills, but brace yourself, because within 4 to 5 years they're going to be irrelevant, and you're going to be coming back here to do another degree. It's now expected, in Australia at least, that most people will do 2 to 3 degrees during the course of their lifetime, because their skills that they learn in one degree are irrelevant and obsolete within 5 to 7 years of their career. They come in and do an arts degree, they go off and become an arts teacher or something or other, then they want to be a manager, they come back to do a management degree, they go off and be a manager, then they think, oh, I would like to move into finance, they come back and do a finance degree. So we have this sense of the idea that education is ongoing, it's continuous, okay? And on the one hand, that sounds kind of fabulous, we should never stop learning, that sounds really awesome, but it's also a demand for constant credentializing, okay? That you need to credentialize yourself. You can't go to the next step until you've got this credential. No, you can't come in here because you don't have that credential. and this constant demand. And what's really interesting within an Australian context, and the same in the US, I don't know so much about India, is that the cost for all that training is increasingly being put onto the student. Okay? Which, if you think about it, is a very, very strange thing, because who benefits the most from your education? Do you benefit the most from your education, or do the people that employ you? And of course the answer is the people who employ you, because they wouldn't be paying you whatever they're paying you if they weren't making more money by paying you, right? So they are definitely making more money from your education than you are ever going to make from your education. So why is it that you are seen to be the person who's benefiting the most from your education, and therefore you should be the one who pays for it? Okay? So it's a very interesting shift within how we have started to think about the idea of education. And certainly within an Australian context, we see education as a commodity. Like, we think every Indian student should come to Australia for at least 3 years, and, you know, swipe your credit card as you come through customs and control. We want you to come through, here's your passport, here's your credit card, give us your money, keep coming into the country, spend 3 years, go to the beach, maybe get a degree, go home again. In fact, we don't care if you never come to class, just give us your money. I'm sure that's not what my Vice-Chancellor would say, but nonetheless, hyperbole and all that. But nonetheless, the idea that education is a commodity is firmly, firmly, firmly entrenched. Within Australia, it's our third highest export. Okay, so you know it's clearly not seen as something that's personally valuable in that sort of 19th century Bildungsroman idea of transformation of the self. No, it's a commodity. So in a disciplinary society, you are always starting all over again, but in a controlled society, you are never done with anything. And you remember Deleuze's discussion of Kafka, where he's trying to get justice and the process is infinite, and that's his definition of hell. You never get to the end of the procedure. So training is constant, it's never complete. Undergraduates today are preparing for jobs that don't exist yet, and told their skills will be rendered obsolete within a couple of years. And at the heart of this stuff is the transformation of work and the way that we think about work. So multi-level rivalry, i.e. competition, has replaced multi-level cooperation. So businesses are constantly introducing, here I'm quoting from Deleuze, an inexorable rivalry presented as a healthy competition, a wonderful motivation that sets individuals against one another and sets itself up in each of them, dividing each within himself. Okay? So old models that, like Ashish Nandi was talking about this morning, about the notion of the village as a cooperative entity, is clearly being replaced by this highly competitive models, which does not reward cooperation. Although it does have this kind of, you know, fantasy about the idea of teamwork. It wonders why teamwork doesn't work so well within the modern organisation. It's because it's competitive. There is no advantage of being part of the team. You want to stand out. And then Deleuze has this, one of my most favourite quotes from Deleuze. He says, "If the stupidest TV game shows are so successful, it is because they are a perfect reflection of the way businesses are run." Now, I don't think Deleuze got to see any reality TV, but I feel fairly sure that that's what he would have thought about reality TV. I don't know if you've seen this, a new TV series, maybe not so brand new anyway, but I was just watching the other day on Netflix or something, called Unreal, which is like a drama about reality TV. Like, if you haven't seen it, it's actually really quite interesting and really kind of gets to the heart of just how heinous reality TV is. I was watching it with my daughter and she's like, "Dad, you don't even watch reality TV." And I said, "What are you talking about? I wrote about reality TV." And she said, "How did you write about reality TV? You don't even watch it." I said, "Listen, I watched it 15 years ago when you were a baby and I wrote about it, and then I decided I hated it so much I was never going to watch it again." And so yes, I did write about reality TV about 15 years ago, but I stopped watching because I absolutely hate it. And I really hate it because it is premised on the kind of all the worst attributes of human society. This kind of horrible competitiveness, this non-cooperativeness, and endless kinds of ways in which people are mean to each other. But the worst aspect of it is the idea that as humans we should sit in judgment on each other and vote somebody off the island. You don't get to be the bachelorette anymore or whatever. Like, who the fuck are we to do that? I mean, the fact that it keeps modeling this idea is, to me, is really, really problematic. And, you know, let's be honest, we have Trump to prove me right that reality TV is bad. I think we can't say anything more than that. So if we think of reality TV in particular, which is built on two kind of ideas, that life is competition, but more importantly, or just as importantly, let's say, that TV fame is the ultimate purpose in life, which in itself is quite worrying. So disciplinary societies have two poles, according to Foucault, signatures representing individuals, places in a register representing a position in the mass. So discipline power both amasses and individualizes. It makes us workers, students, and so on, and gives us an identity. So as a student, we are massified, but from that mass, we gain ourselves an identity as being part of a solidarity. By contrast, control societies focus on codes. The digital language of control is made up of codes indicating whether across the same information should be allowed or should be denied. So individuals become dividuals, and masses have become samples, data, markets, and banks. So getting back to Facebook, the reason why Facebook is so stonkingly rich in terms of capital is because it sells your data, right? So that's the thing. You aren't consumers of Facebook. You are the products, and you get sold on to other people. But what is really amazing about Facebook from the point of view of marketing is just how detailed that data that you give them actually is. Okay, so if you've never thought about how much data you're giving Facebook, let me just give you some examples of what you're giving Facebook. Every time you tag yourself in a photo and you say, "This is me," you are beta testing a facial recognition software program, the same facial recognition software program that is being used by drone technology to target people in Afghanistan and say, well, you know, that's so-and-so, let's blow him up. So you are helping to design that military technology. Every single time you're teaching the computer, it's getting smarter and smarter. One day that drone may be coming for you, so you might want to think twice about pressing. Every time you like something, you are building up a metadata of what does your culture like. So in India, we like pictures of cats or not, I don't know. In Australia, we apparently love pictures of cats. Like if you want to get lots of likes, have a picture of a cat, you with a cat, your cat doing something amazing, millions of likes. What that says about us as a culture, I don't know. But nonetheless, you are giving affective and emotive data about yourself, and collectively, it says something very, very interesting about your particular society. So the data that you're giving to Facebook goes way beyond them knowing your name, your address, your salary, your gender, your sexual preferences, etc., etc. They know everything. I mean, they really, really know everything. There's never been this level of data collection in history, okay? Like the government in the past, when they took a census data, they could ask you, you know, where did you live, and you know how old you are, how much money do you earn, that sort of thing. But they didn't ask you, do you like pictures of fluffy cats? You know, are you partial to, you know, gay sex? No, none of those kinds of questions could ever be asked. But on Facebook, you're giving out that information all the time, and they're just, you know, happily storing it away. So when they do marketing, the level of detail that they can get down to is, we want all the women aged between 20 and 25 living in this particular postcode. We want all the single women. We want all the single women who have an interest in cats. Bang, we're going to send them advertisements for cat food. Not only that, when you have Facebook open on your computer, it can read everything on your computer, okay? So it's not just what you're doing on your computer that it's reading, it reads everything. So it knows where you've been, so it tracks your data, so it has all your GPS tracking data, so it knows where you go shopping, it knows when you go shopping. If you use your electronic card, it can probably even tell you how much you spent while you were there. The level of tracking data is phenomenal. So what Deleuze predicted with Control Society, he probably couldn't, in his wildest of dreams, have imagined just how detailed the level of that control data actually has become, okay? But also by reverse, the advertisements. So like if you don't believe me, just open Facebook, open another tab, Google something outrageous, I want a new Ferrari, and then wait and see how long it is before on your Facebook feed you start getting ads for Ferraris. Okay, it's almost instantaneous, and just so make sure you don't look at porn while you got Facebook open, because then you'll get a whole different kind of ads, which your friends will be looking over your shoulder. Why do you keep getting these ads? I don't know. It's persecution. Somebody knows something that I don't know. So keep that one to yourself. So digital control is made up of codes, as I said, indicating whether access to some information should be allowed or disallowed. So, for example, Deleuze talks about it in terms of money. So discipline was the gold standard. Control would be a floating exchange. The current Bitcoin insanity is the perfect example of this idea of a floating exchange. I mean, Bitcoin is the most dematerialized form of value that we can possibly think of. It has no reference to anything in the world. There isn't even a thing called a Bitcoin. Like, you can't even just walk around with a Bitcoin in your hand, because it doesn't exist, right? It's completely dematerialized value. If you 20 odd years ago, you'd smoked some opium and said, I've got this idea for money that's just kind of generated out of nothing on my computer. People are like, yeah, like, keep smoking, but never going to happen. But look what we have now, Bitcoin, right? The most kind of most amazingly appreciating value asset in the world anywhere. That is nothing. It's dematerialized. There's no such thing as a Bitcoin. So we can use machines then as a way of characterizing a certain type of society, not because machines determine that society, but rather because machines are an expression of the social forms capable of producing and using them. So the thing that Deleuze and Guattari always say is that society comes before machine. So normally the other way around, people say you have the machines, then you have the society. But Deleuze and Guattari always argue that the society has to be capable of appreciating the machine, okay? And that certain things can be invented and they just disappear and fall away because that society was not capable of appreciating them. And mobile phones were like that, okay? Now, most of you in the room here are kind of too young to remember the time when mobile phones first came out. And I don't know what it was like in India, but I know in Australia, when mobile phones first came out, if your phone rang, there would be sort of an elaborate apology. Oh, sorry, just got to answer my phone. And then you'd be like, this whole thing of acting really weird about answering your phone. But now you'd be like, students in their class talking on their phone, and nobody is embarrassed about it. Like on a train, I don't know if this is like happens in India, but if you're on a train in Australia, you can learn the most alarmingly personal things about people. Like you're sitting there next to them on the train, and they're on their phone and saying, "Oh, my boyfriend, he did this, and I really don't like it." I'm like, "Whoa! How do I get out of here? This is going way, way past overshare." And so our way of thinking about mobile phones and the etiquette relating to how this device is integrated into our society has completely changed over the last 20 odd years. But my point is there was a moment of resistance. So in Australia, anybody who had a mobile phone was treated as basically being a yuppie, which was code for being a wanker. We didn't really like them. But now, like when I said who has a mobile phone, nobody was embarrassed about it. But 25 years ago, if you had a mobile phone, you would have kind of gone, like, maybe me. Don't really want to admit it because, obviously I'm a wanker if I have a mobile phone. But, that has completely changed. I must tell you one small story about mobile phones, which I absolutely love. I probably tell it everywhere I go. But I went to China in 2004, and I was listening to a lecture by Frederick Jameson. And mobile phones had obviously just become a really big thing in China at that point, and so practically everyone in the room had one. And they all had really loud, really annoying ringtones. And nobody turned their phone off before the lecture. And so the phones were just ringing constantly, and poor old Fred's standing out there trying to give his lecture on postmodernism or something. And they were just like phone answering. But because they weren't rude, they did answer their phone, but because they weren't rude, they had to go like this. And so apparently in Chinese culture at that time, it was not rude to talk on the phone, providing no one could see you. And so it didn't matter how loud they talked, like this. Yeah, John, yeah, no problem. And so the rest of us had just, we're just sitting in the room going, this is the most peculiar thing we've ever seen. There's a whole cultural formation around the mobile phone that, obviously bypassed us completely. So I find those kinds of things really kind of interesting, the way by devices are embraced within a culture, we don't really know what to do with them, and then they have the effect of changing culture. At an earlier time, you might have talked about the TV, for example. Megan Morris, who's an Australian cultural studies person, has this very nice paper where she talks about the way by which TVs came into their home, and they were initially treated as a piece of furniture. And they were quite big, elaborate boxes and so forth. Nobody knew what to do with them. So they kind of were treated as furniture. So they were made as really handsome boxes, and people put pot plants on them. And like when I was growing up, our TV had a drinks cabinet built into it, which I think is a tradition they should bring back. They had the TV on the side, and on this side of it was a drinks cabinet. You go and open it up, and you have all your drinks there and everything, and you pour yourself a shot of whiskey or something and sit back to watch the news. I don't know. But those ideas for televisions have completely disappeared. The TV is no longer a piece of furniture. It's dematerialized flat screen on your wall. So sovereign societies, i.e. pre-disciplinary societies, worked with simple machines, with levers, with pulleys, with clocks. Disciplined societies worked with thermodynamic machines, so trains, steam engines, and so on. Control societies work with third-generation machines, computers. Now, this transformation, according to Deleuze, reflects a transformation in capitalism itself. In the 19th century, capitalism was concentrated, directed towards production and proprietary. Capital owned sites of production, and markets were won by reducing costs via specialization or colonization, or both. Of course, India is the perfect example of this. Britain, came to India not because it particularly wanted to have another colony, but because it saw it as a massive market, and the best way to control the market was to control the country. That's what they mean by when the Britons say that they, took over India in a fit of absence. What they really mean is actually they just saw this massive market and they didn't want to give up on it, and so they stuck around for as long as they plausibly could. Today, though, in control society, capital is no longer focused on production. Production accounts for only a very small part of global wealth. So just to give you an idea, capital, if you think of capital as just money that makes money through some miraculous process of interest or magic or voodoo or something, for every $1 of manufacturing, there is $30 of pure capital, okay? So like if all manufacturing stopped overnight, it would be a catastrophe, of course, but the financial markets would kick on. Now that's why when the banking crisis hit in 2008, it was such a crisis, because the ratio of money in banking and finance, etc., is 30 to 1 of manufacturing. So it hit the most kind of important sector. So that's what Deleuze is talking about, that production is no longer anywhere near as important as pure financial speculation, which is completely dematerialized and depends on a range of factors that have nothing to do with producing real things in the world. So control society buys and sells services as well as activities. Control is dispersive, not concentrative. As Deleuze puts it, family, school, army, factory are no longer so many analogous but different sites converging on an owner, but rather transmutable configurations of a single business. And so the modern businesses have expanded dramatically. So schools, hospital, factories were all organs of the state, even if they weren't necessarily state-owned, in as much as their primary purpose was to advance the collective interest of the nation. And this is what Foucault meant by biopower. In disciplinary society, this is no longer the case. Schools, hospital, factories, and so on have become, so not in disciplinary society, in control society, this is no longer the case, that schools, hospitals, and factories and prisons have all become business opportunities, ways for capital to make money. And I was reading a really interesting example. There's a book that came out last year called The Attention Merchants, which is, I think, quite a fascinating book. But the example that the book opens with, which is I think quite telling, talks about a high school in America that was lacking in funding, and someone come along and said, look, we can give you $500,000 a year, and the school was like, wow, that's amazing. What do we have to do for it? And so it turned out all they had to do was to allow every computer in the classroom to carry advertisements. So that while the kids were reading their text for mathematics or social science or whatever, just across the bottom of the screen it would be like, buy a McDonald's or whatever. And so there was a real question about, well, is that the way of the future of education? Should we let private industries fund education at the expense of, putting our kids in front of advertising from the earliest possible age? Or should we say, no, the school should be funded by the government and private corporations should be kept out of it? So control society is raising these kinds of questions for us. All right, now I guess am I out of time now? Oh, okay. So what time do you want me to stop?
10 minutes more.
Oh, okay. So maybe just take some questions now instead? Okay, so I haven't obviously answered my opening question of what does it mean to be connected. And maybe in 9 lectures I still won't have answered it. But it is a theme for us to come back to. So I'll stop there with this particular lecture and take some questions if you have any. To say this room is a bit boiled frog, I'm feeling a bit...
The future seems to be very bleak. So is there any possibility of escaping this kind of control?
The future's awesome. We have Netflix and Facebook. How to escape from Facebook? Well, pretty easy. Deactivate your account, uninstall it from your phone, and, just forget about your friends. But isn't that the fear, right? Like you think, they even have the acronym for it, FOMO, fear of missing out. If I uninstall Facebook, then I won't know what my friend is wearing to the ball. And oh my God, and she won't see my cute little cat video that I just made. And so we don't. But it would be that simple. 2 billion people collectively say, fuck Facebook, we're going to deactivate and uninstall from our phones. And, within a couple of weeks, Facebook is history.
Can we escape from the mobile phone, sir?
Sorry?
Can we escape from this phone, the phone?
Well, same thing. Cancel your service. Do we actually